Well, I don't think James actually penned the Epistle of James, but I think that letter contains Jamesian tradition.
Pois assim como o corpo sem o espírito é morto, a fé sem obras é morta.
So James was well versed in the Jewish tradition, and he upheld the idea, not just as Paul did, that you just had to have faith, but that works was an extraordinarily important component within that faith.
Referências a Tiago aparecem também fora do Novo Testamento. Entre eles, os escritos do historiador judeu Flávio Joséfo.
Flavius Josephus, who lived between 37 and 100 AD or so, and is the most important source for the period. He wrote 30 volumes of Greek language history about Judea and its relations with Rome. And it's only in the last volume, in about a third of a sentence, where James actually appears.
Ele convocou os juízes do Sinédrio e trouxe perante eles o irmão de Jesus, cujo nome era Tiago.
And since the inscription says James, the brother of Jesus, was son of Joseph, well, there are some areas of intersection between what Josephus says about James and what is written on the inscription on the ossuary.
So James does not play a large role in the history that Josephus writes, but Josephus is very important for understanding the history of James because what he does write about is James's death. And it is this information that André Lemaire relies upon in dating the James ossuary.
James' death, that's not a complicated problem. You have only to read Flavio Josephus. It tells the story of the death of James because it occurred at a special moment between the nomination of two procurators.
And he says that there was a nasty piece of work named Ananus who became high priest. Now this Ananus, in illustration of how bad a fellow he was, Josephus says that when he became high priest, he just convened a court and got rid of some people he didn't like.
In a time when there was no Roman governor in office because one had died and the next one was on the way, he had James and certain other Jewish citizens executed, stoned.
Como esse evento ocorreu durante o intervalo entre dois procuradores ou governadores romanos, Lemaire obteve uma data precisa.
We know the date of the procurator, so we know the date of the death of James, 62 AD.
James died. Well, he dies in 62. And he would be placed in an ossuary. His bones would be placed in an ossuary about a year later, so around 63.
And when we come back, the geological evidence. Does it prove or disprove that the ossuary really belongs to James, the brother of Jesus? When scholars first discovered the ossuary with its intriguing inscriptions, they relied on early historical descriptions of James's death to ascertain that his remains would have been put into an ossuary in the year 63. Then they had to find out if the ossuary could be dated to that time period as well. And so, to determine this, the artifact was put to the test.
This artifact, irrespective of whether or not it is the ossuary of the brother of James, is interesting, important, and significant. It is important because it gives us insight into Jewish burial in the 1st century of the Common Era, AD. It is important because it is an artifact that tells a story.
Limestone ossuaries came into use in the 1st century BCE. In fact, they came into use in the 20s, right around the time of the building of Herod's temple. That's when stonemasons developed techniques to work on limestone that they were working on for the temple. And in the process, you have a flourishing of limestone vessels, limestone tables, and limestone ossuaries that are used throughout the 1st century that ends right around 70 AD with the destruction of the Jewish temple by the Romans.
Para datar com exatidão o ossuário de Tiago, a arca foi estudada por cientistas do Observatório Geológico de Israel a pedido de Herschel Shanks e André Lemaire, as pessoas que trouxeram o ossuário à luz.
Because of its importance and because of questions of authenticity and so on, the ossuary was tested by experts, highly qualified people in a laboratory. And the results were reassuring in the sense that they found the characteristics, the physical characteristics that we would expect with an ancient object.
Para descobrir que tipos de testes foram feitos no ossuário de Tiago, fomos ao Museu de Arte do Condado de Los Angeles. Aqui, especialistas como Marco Leone e John Hirks conduziram testes sofisticados em artefatos antigos, como esta lápide de calcário egípcia.
So when you receive an artifact, what type of test do you initially do? What's the first thing you do?
Well, the first thing we want to make sure is that the object is stable. We would use the stereobinocular microscope to explore the surface. We're looking for all different aspects of age. We're looking for wear and tear from makers, manufacturing, technology, handling with time.
Além de procurar sinais de envelhecimento para autenticar um artefato, os cientistas examinam o material usado na construção.
The initial examination of the object should very clearly tell me that it's limestone. When I look at the object, it's a very fine-grained limestone that's clear both visually as well as under the microscope. But if we want to know what kind of limestone it is and more about where it might have come from geologically speaking, then I would turn to Marco and we would begin a dialogue of taking samples, and Marco would undertake various studies to determine elemental composition, maybe even using a scanning electron microscope to study various aspects of the limestone.
We take small fragments that are then analyzed with microscopes that are more powerful, and they have possibilities of spectroscopic analysis. We use the scanning electron microscope for elemental analysis. That gives us both the composition of the stone, because there's a spectrograph attached to it, and the microscopic morphology at a far higher magnification than is possible with other techniques.
Com uma capacidade de ampliação de 3.000 a 20.000 vezes, o microscópio que escaneia elétrons pode revelar a composição exata de uma pedra e sua estrutura.
We have, of course, a major signal for calcium. Limestone is composed of calcium carbonate. We have a certain amount of silicon and the presence of aluminum, magnesium, potassium, elements that are found in silica and clays that are commonly found in certain types of limestone.
A composição química do calcário varia de acordo com sua procedência. Uma análise adequada pode situar a origem de um ossuário de calcário em uma época e localidade específicas.
Taking the chemical analysis forward with trace analysis would probably allow a specialized laboratory to pinpoint the location of the quarry from which the limestone was extracted.
Ao testar o ossuário de Tiago, o Observatório Geológico achou sua composição consistente com calcário extraído perto de Jerusalém no século I. Partículas de solo achadas no ossuário combinam com amostras colhidas nessas pedreiras. Outro elemento importante para os cientistas considerarem é a pátina.
as the stone is aging and reacting with atmospheric elements in your hands and so on and so forth, you're developing a different kind of surface which people commonly refer to as a patina. And if this object didn't have this very aged surface, that would send up a lot of signs of concern that the object wasn't authentic. The general surface of the object develops a patina that's a little bit different from what develops inside or around an inscription, where it's not so easy to alter the original surface.
É justamente a pátina na inscrição do ossuário de Tiago que tem gerado debate. O Observatório Geológico anunciou ter achado pátina nas cavidades de algumas letras, mas outras letras parecem ter sido limpas, destruindo a pátina.
What wasn't specified is, at least in the written report, which letters were tested. Were all the letters of the inscription tested? Were only some? And if only some were tested, which ones lacked the patina? Because you see, if there's not, that would imply that the inscription was modern because it cut through the patina.
Though the testing showed that the James ossuary most likely came from the 1st century, many experts are calling for further testing to clear up some issues, like the missing patina. And the experts also caution that even if the patina stands the test, forgery cannot entirely be ruled out.
Certainly, it's been proven that it's not a bad forgery, but that doesn't mean that it's authentic.
People artificially create patinas on a regular basis, and we spend a lot of time differentiating between ancient patinas that have been created by virtue of their existence in time versus something that has been created recently.
There are forgers, and they operate quite widely in the Middle East. They're sort of kitchen sink chemists who concoct various formulas and give chemical baths to artifacts and then bury them, rebury them, expose them again, and pass them off as authentic with a chemically enhanced patina on them.
Com crescente e lucrativo mercado de antiguidades alimentado por falsificadores e saqueadores, o estudo de artefatos antigos se torna cada vez mais complicado.
The antiquities market is actually quite old. We already have forgeries from the Byzantine period when early Christians were fabricating evidence for Jesus or the biblical period or the Gospels. What pilgrims wanted was to take home something with a cross on it, something that would inspire them, something that may have been touched by Jesus.
Very often looters grab what is more appealing to the market, and they will destroy small objects that indeed can tell us a lot, small pots, small fragments. Also, they may, by handling the object, remove clues as to the authenticity.
This may be authentic, but they still think it encourages people who are involved in questionable activities, and they don't think that archaeological artifacts from a non-verifiable location should be entertained at all. And I unfortunately have to agree.
A seguir, por que uma inscrição de 3 nomes gerou tanta discussão na comunidade científica?
And the question is, why add this after somebody has inscribed James, son of Joseph?
Nesta terça, às 23 horas, o submarino não detectável que daria a vitória a Hitler jaz no fundo do mar. Descubra o que fez mudar o rumo da história a favor dos aliados em Detetives das Profundezas, Guerra de Submarinos, somente por The History Channel.
There are hundreds of ossuaries in museums and private collections around the world. What makes the James ossuary extraordinary, why we care about it so much, is the inscription on it. James, son of Joseph, brother Jesus. So, what are the particulars of this inscription?
Ela tem cerca de 19 centímetros de comprimento e menos de 1 centímetro de altura. Da direita para a esquerda diz o seguinte: Yaakov, Bar Yosef, Ahui, de Yeshua, que significa Tiago ou Jacó, filho de José, irmão de Jesus.
It is the first mention of Jesus in epigraphy. Otherwise, we know Jesus only from the literary tradition. And it is not the same thing to know somebody from the literary tradition and to see at once an inscription with his name in the stone. You realize much more directly that they were living people.
Dúvidas, porém, persistem sobre a inscrição referir-se de fato a Jesus de Nazaré. Estudar essas 20 letras em aramaico pode fornecer a maior pista para a datação do ossuário. Mas é uma tarefa difícil e especializada.
Handwriting looks different depending on the medium you're using. That is, if you consider the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, people wrote those using a brush with ink on leather. And that kind of writing looks quite different from what you would produce if you're scratching letters into a stone object of some kind, which is what, of course, was done in this case.
A linguagem usada na inscrição em aramaico fornece uma pista de quando foi feita, pois o aramaico era o idioma cotidiano na Palestina do século I, o lugar e a época em que Cristo viveu.
Fortunately, I should say, we know Jesus only with a Greek text, but Jesus was mainly, at least, speaking Aramaic. So for once, we are closer to the words of Jesus, I should say.
Mas a língua é apenas uma pista. Paleógrafos especialistas em escrita antiga examinam muitos fatores antes de determinar a idade de um artefato.
The important question of all is the writing itself, handwriting. In other words, we know the way they wrote, we know what the handwriting looked like in different periods, and this is the science of paleography that refers to the way handwriting develops.
Com o tempo, a escrita aramaica sofreu pequenas mudanças. Os especialistas utilizam essas sutis diferenças para datar inscrições. André Lemaire acredita que essa inscrição foi feita no período anterior à destruição de Jerusalém, em 70 d.C., período no qual Tiago morreu. Lemaire embasa sua opinião no formato cursivo de 3 letras: o Dalet, o Yod e o Aleph.
There doesn't seem to be too much debate about the first part of the inscription, which says Yaakov Bar Yosef. There is much more debate about the second half of the inscription and the crucial part that says the brother of Jesus.
The right-hand part of the inscription, which is the beginning part, appears to be in one particular kind of hand. It's very crisp. The letters are very angular, square-like. And there are little tiny triangular wedges on the tops of some of the letters, which make it very specifically this kind of first century Aramaic. The left-hand part, people say this is written by another hand.
The letters there reflect a cursive hand as opposed to a more elegant, formal hand in the first part, Jacob Bar Yosef portion of the inscription. The shin in particular is troublesome. The double yod is problematical. They look like double letters. The ayin, which ends the entire inscription, is very problematic. It does not match the ayin in Jacob.
Ossuary inscriptions are written very casually in many cases, and we do see mixing of cursive and formal types in those inscriptions. What's striking in this case, though, is that the first part of the inscription, the Jacob, son of Joseph, is formal, and the strikingly cursive forms that we see all come in the second part. It's not as if it's mixed throughout the inscription, and this does raise the possibility that we're dealing with two hands.
It not only is a different hand, but suggests a different time span, a different chronological date in origin.
Outros especialistas também levantaram dúvidas sobre a escolha do dialeto usado na inscrição. Os três nomes, Tiago, José e Jesus, são recorrentes na Jerusalém do século I. Mas a palavra-chave irmão de suscitou questionamentos.
The word for brother itself in Judean Aramaic is ahohi, has a he at the end. In the inscription, we have the word ahui without the he, without the H sound. That's indicative of Galilean Aramaic. So one would surmise that the second part of the inscription quite likely was written by a Galilean, and reasonably one could suggest that it would have been post-1st century. And the question is, why add this after somebody has inscribed James, son of Joseph? Why now would a Galilean hand write brother of Jesus after the 1st century? That was the thing that interested me.
Well, one possibility is that the person that added this was himself an early Christian. And either knew that this was indeed the ossuary of James, who was the brother of Jesus from the New Testament, and wanted to simply specify that. Or perhaps he hoped it was. Now, I should say in all candor that the other possibility for the second-hand idea is that it's modern, and that someone at some point added brother of Jesus in order to make an ordinary ossuary into a sensational object so we would all get excited about it as we are. That seems to me to be less likely than the possibility of an ancient second hand on the basis of what I know of the physical examination that's been done of the ossuary.
Various theories have been offered about the inscription. Yet some experts believe that the inscription is from the 1st century and therefore could possibly be related to Jesus of Nazareth.
I follow the school that is inclined to say that this is all by the same person, and that the minor discrepancies in the script are, if I write a letter, I'm sure some of the letters at the bottom of the page are not going to be identical to those at the top. Minor discrepancies for me are not a big deal.
So people are saying there are two hands in this.
Well, that's not true. That's not true because there are not two styles. You have only a few letters which are more cursive than other ones. Almost the same kind of difference between capital and minuscule. You have sometimes the presence of a few more cursive letters. That also is a phenomenon which is very well known on ossuaries, because the inscriptions on ossuary are not the same as the inscription on manuscripts. They are more or less a kind of a graffito. When you look very carefully at the inscription, it is very clear that it was done only with one hand.
And so the debate continues. But ultimately, the differences between our experts may be very small. It's almost as if you have to choose who you want to believe, just like the matter of faith. Which raises even another issue. Is a physical artifact needed to prove the Bible? We'll put that question next to our experts when we come back.